right, I think we can go ahead and get started in another moment here. It looks like our numbers are starting to even out. Do you want to get us started, Chandan?
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. There's still some people coming in, so we'll do a little housekeeping and logistics while we let people settle in. You'll see that the chat function is open. Please feel free to use this chat to chat amongst yourselves, to do any finger snapping you feel inclined to do, to thank Jack for joining us here in Seattle and being a part of our community and conversation for the evening. We'll make sure to get all this to Jack in the chat, so he won't be able to see the chat while he's also trying to engage us and the panelists and offer his remarks, but he will get them afterwards, so just know that that will happen. We are, there's still a few more people coming in, so I'm just gonna let us give them a second. We are hoping to make this a very lively event this evening, and Jack is an amazing Q&A person on his feet, so please think about questions that you might have while Jack is talking, and the rest of us are also offering remarks, and put them in the chat. There's not a Q&A box, but there is this chat box. Please put them in the chat box. Caitlin Palo from the Simpson Center is going to be culling those questions and putting them onto a doc for me to look at. And we'll try to get through some of them, or as many of them as we can, in the time that we have available tonight. All right, with that said, it's entirely my pleasure to welcome everyone to tonight's event on this release of this amazing, amazing book, which has the best cover in the world, Wild Things by Jack Halberstam. I want to just make a few thank yous first. First and foremost, thanks to Elliott Bay Books. Elliott Bay Books is where all of us who are wild go to live out our lives, and without it, we would have no resource. And it is just been the center of all of the good things about Seattle for me. Jack has been a speaker at Elliott Bay a number of times, and we're just so grateful for their persistence, even through COVID. We also want to thank the Simpson Center for the Humanities and Caitlin Palo, especially for all the logistic work that she did to get us to this evening, and all the work that she's doing while the event is happening. The back room of communication is rarely acknowledged, and we want to just say that without it, none of us would be talking tonight. I also want to take a moment to note that we're on the unceded lands of the Duwamish and the Coast Salish people, and all evidence is that we have been miserable guests on these lands, and we hope that we can begin the work of working to be better guests on these lands. And Jack's ruminations tonight, as well as his book, is really an engagement with that question of acknowledging what kinds of miserable guests we as settlers and arrivants have been on these lands. So it's particularly important to acknowledge the Duwamish and the Coast Salish and their ongoing struggle to reclaim stewardship of these lands and the relations that they have to the various beings of this land. It's now also my pleasure to introduce our various speakers tonight. First, we'll be hearing from Jack Halberstam. Jack Halberstam, as you know, and many of you do know him as a formidable and premier queer theorist and one of the founding intellectuals of queer theory and queer studies. He's also the professor of gender studies in English at Columbia University. He's the author of 7 books, including most recently, The Queer Art of Failure in 2011, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal in 2012, and a short book titled Trans**, a quick and quirky account of gender variance by the University of California Press. Halberstam's latest book from Duke University Press, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, was released just a few months ago. So we're getting this hot off the presses. He was also awarded the Arcus Places Prize in 2018 for innovative public scholarship on the relationship between gender, sexuality, and the built environment. And he's now finishing the 2nd volume to this project on wildness titled The Wild Beyond: Music, Architecture, and Anarchy. After Jack speaks and introduces the book and some of its concepts, we're going to be shifting to some reflections by one of my dear friends, María Elena García. María Elena García is an associate professor in the comparative history of ideas at the University of Washington in Seattle. Her first book, Making Indigenous Citizens, Identity, Development, and Multicultural Activism in Peru, was released by Stanford University Press in 2005, and it examined indigenous and intellectual politics in Peru in the immediate aftermath of the war between the Senadero Luminosos and the state. Sorry about that. And her second book, Gastropolitics and the Specter of Race, Stories of Capital, Culture, and Coloniality in Peru, is out from UC Press literally this week. So a huge congratulations. It's like a double book celebration. And it offers a critical examination of the Peruvian gastronomic revolution. Her work emphasizes the way celebratory narratives about food perpetuate settler colonial violence against native bodies and focuses on the intersections of race, species, and capital in contemporary Peru. And as you can tell from this brief bio, no one could be a more suitable and apt interlocutor for Jack's book than María Elena García. After María Elena, we'll have some more informal, kind of off-the-cusp remarks from Radhika and myself. Let me introduce another dear friend of mine, Radhika Govindrajan, who is in the amazing red background that we're all jealous of. Radhika is Associate Professor of Anthropology and International Studies at the University of Washington. She's the author of Animal Intimacies, Interspecies Relatedness in India's Central Himalayas. And this is an absolutely exceptional ethnography of human-animal relations. And in fact, one that Jack thought with for a long time as he was composing his own work. And Radhika's work appears in Jack's pages, so we're particularly lucky to have her reflections on his reflections of her reflections. Those are the relations that we're going for. And with that, I will first pass it to Jack to offer us a little bit of an introduction to this amazing book you've written, Jack. And thank you again for being with us tonight. We couldn't be happier.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chandan. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And of course, I'm really grateful to María Elena and Radhika for agreeing to join me this evening and to think about some of the concepts in the book. So I have some slides to sort of make this go down a little bit easier. I'll go to share screen and see if we can get this going. There we go. And here's the book. I wanted to say something about the book cover, as Chandan said. It's a very beautiful cover, and the sculpture on the cover is by an amazing artist based in LA, queer Asian American artist Candice Lin, who thinks a lot about things like petrifaction and about geological processes, and conjures these really incredible worlds in her artwork. And I love this piece so much, and I'm really grateful to her for letting me use it on the book cover. So this is it's a really interesting book for me to introduce, because the last couple of books that I've written have been almost aimed at a popular audience. I cannot say I ever found a popular audience. I think as an academic, you always think you're being way more accessible than you really are. But Gaga Feminism and Trans Asterix, we're not necessarily going for academic readership. Wild Things, on the other hand, is kind of, to my dismay, an academic book. It is, and it's actually way more engaged with canonical texts than I would have imagined when I began. But there is a reason for that. And the reason is that if you want to lay out the history of an idea, such as wildness, you actually have to track that idea through the hegemonic forms that have produced it. Like, you can't just jump into, you know, a free wild, a wild that has been, for example, delinked from a civilizing project. Wildness has meaning in the modern period precisely because of the relationship between colonialism and this concept, this vague concept of civilization. And of course, everything that was on the outside or the borders of civilization were basically classified as wild. That means that the category of wild is quite a dangerous category to play with, precisely because it contains within it so many traces of violent othering, racialization, colonial projects, and so on. But here's the reward. There is a big payoff to actually trying to claim wildness for new ways of thinking, which is basically what this book is trying to do. And the payoff has to do with unleashing wildness from this function of being the other to civilization, and using it to deconstruct the category of civilization in the first place, but also to find within wildness all the different categories of being that have been lumped together as civilizations outside. And so within the category of wildness, we find the animal, the child, we find colonized peoples, definitely Blackness, and certainly indigeneity. And so there is a kind of interesting way of thinking through the relationships between these modes of being that have been placed outside of a colonial order. Simple as that, okay? It also is in many ways, a kind of anti-epistemological project, by which I mean that it pulls us into terrain that is not simply unknown, but unknowable. And it asks us as humans to sit with the possibility that there are things in the world that we cannot know, whose scripts we cannot learn, whose relationship to being remain opaque to us. So all of that is available under the heading of the wild. Okay, so what I'm going to do, this book jumps around wildly, as is appropriate, and it dips in and out of children's literature, animal studies, Indigenous representation, Afro-pessimism, lost figures of queerness, falconry, if you can believe it, and pets. That's kind of the range. And I'm actually not going to apologize for the ranginess of the archive. I'm going to say that that's what happens when you take a step back from, you know, sort of the organizational logic of a discipline, and you set about trying to both diffuse a category that is being used against whole groups of people, but also to sort of appropriate that category and turn it into something else, something wondrous. That's what we're going to try to do. Okay, so let me just go to play mode here with the screen. There we go. So a few highlights then from the really, you know, all over the place archive that I share with you in the book. Many people will have encountered the colonial concept of the wild, as well as a kind of queer concept of the wild through this amazing children's book, Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are. And I make a little bit in the book out of the fact that Maurice Sendak was a gay man, and that his little hero, Max, is someone who is fleeing the family home, something that I think in COVID we can all make common cause with and all completely sympathize with. He's fleeing the family home, and he's going off through, you know, this dreamscape to arrive where the wild things are. But the question that is raised by this book is not only where is the wild for Max, but in many ways it asks us to think about what is the wild for the wild things, right? Because Max is just a visitor. Max in many ways is not the wild. Max is the white colonial explorer through whom the wild appears. And the wild appears, remember, in the children's story, as a place that he goes to mostly to escape his mother and to escape the role of child in the family home. When he arrives at where the wild things are, he's able to set himself up as a sovereign being. And you see that little crown, you know, on his head. He, instead of being the person who is ruled in the family home, he can be the sovereign ruler where the wild things are. So we see what the appeal is for Max. For Max, the appeal is he is king of the wild things. But I do think that the book, which is steeped in a kind of sadness and melancholia, I think that the melancholia of the wild things is precisely because we realize, even as child readers, we realize that the wild things are wild precisely because they have been ejected from the domestic space and the tidy world of nuclear families, nation, state, all of those kinds of formations. And so the question remains and lingers at the end, you know, what would be wild for the wild things? And if anyone saw the film Where the Wild Things Are, the Spike Jonze film, you will know that that film really digs into how ruined these wild creatures are. And in fact, the film was so sad that children did not want to see the film. It was very much an adult film. And the figures in the film, and I write about this in the book, were literally bowed down by the puppet costumes that they had to wear. They were very, very heavy costumes. And so you had this sense of the wild things as not just rambunctious, playful creatures, but as creatures who were in ruination precisely because what was constituted as wild was everything that the world could not accept. And so there's something, to me, very beautiful about this narrative, but it also opens onto a question. The wild things, I should emphasize, are not a subaltern group awaiting liberation. They are the consequence of investing in the way that we do in a kind of heteronormative narrative of Oedipal domestic stability. Okay, so there are a few, I want to tell you a little story about this panel on the left. I mean, this is where the power of the narrative really comes from, is how clever the images are on the topic of wildness itself. So yes, the pictures of the wild things are very beautifully drawn, but look at this image on the left. You have Max, who is dressed in a wild animal costume, right? I think it's the wolf costume, and he's chasing the family dog. So he's more wild than the pet, and this comes up later in the book. The pet is reduced to like a weird, fluffy, domestic prosthetic, if you like. In this image, it's Max who is wild, but he's chasing the pet with a fork in his hand, which is really weird because this is his friend, his pet, not an animal he should be wanting to eat. So there's a lot of upheaval in this scene about the proper relationships between the human and the animal that are being upended. To just finish off that panel, however, notice on the wall, there is yet another level of representation. There is a picture of a wild thing. And we learn that the author of the wild thing is Max himself, by Max. So in this little graphic, we see that the white male subject is able to organize the logic that connects all of these different levels of representation, being, animality, wildness, civilization, and so on together. He can move in and out of the category of the wild, but everything else is sort of stuck in place. So I went to the Sendak Foundation, where I knew somebody who worked with Maurice Sendak's estate, and I asked to use this image in the book. And they gave me permission and sent us a really lovely copy. And then at the last minute, they told us that you can only use this image for 5 years. And at that point, it would be pulled. Well, no publisher can publish a book organized around typesetting and layout with an image that they're going to have to remove after 5 years. So at the last minute, we actually couldn't use this image. And I think that's really a shame. And I was tempted to find a pirated version of some of the images from Where the Wild Things Are and use them, but I didn't. So I'm showing you these images, but sadly in the book, I cannot access them. Anyway, let's move on. So Where the Wild Things Are comes up several times in the book. I have a chapter that links Where the Wild Things Are to Jan Martel's The Life of Pi, and so on. But I want to say something about how I understand wildness. And this is a quote from the book. Wildness is a kind of discursive force that underpins the order of things. And what I'm thinking by that is, if, as Foucault proposes in the 18th century, colonial explorers went out to discover, the world outside of a Euro-American context, and to produce knowledge about it, and to then produce an ordered regime on the basis of that knowledge, Foucault suggests that this is when we see a shift towards an order of things. And he, in a book by the same name, lays out this order of things. My point is a simple point. If there is an order of things, there must also be a disorder of things. And it is that disorder where we find a kind of rebellion against everything that governmentality, management, disciplinarity sets in play. And there are a number of different places we can look for that disorder. And my book sets out to follow those breadcrumbs towards some of these sites of disorder. And it's interesting to me how much order and disorder sort of depend upon each other when we are trying to investigate the decolonial. So this is a beautiful image by Julie Moretu, who's about to have a big retrospective at the MoMA. And of course, Moretu is known for these kind of exploding map-like paintings that, on the one hand, disrupt the idea of a map with its flat logic and its laying out of terrain and space and placing everything, like in Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, the colors matching up to a particular colonial ordering of space and ownership and occupation and so on. And instead, in Moretu's work, we get this exploding disorder, but still within the grid. If you notice, the Moretu painting is still a grid there. And this is part of a logic of wildness that I call bewilderment. And I want to dig in to bewilderment next. So this is one of, and I did not use this image in the book either, but the category of bewilderment for me allows me to open onto the relationship between modernism and the many indigenous forms of representation that modernists drew from, learned from, and stole, okay? And the person who has pointed out this relationship between the modern and the indigenous most carefully is the queer Swampy Cree artist, two-spirit artist, Kemp Monkman, who's based in Toronto and has set out to really repaint all of these scenes of encounter in the West between you know, the cowboys and the people who were pushing west in the 19th century in the US to reverse the logics of this encounter between cowboy and Indian, so that we begin to understand that indigeneity comes before modernism and then is sort of, you know, sucked up by modernism. So the book doesn't shy away from the obvious, and I would say even often embarrassing connections between the wild and blackness and the wild and indigeneity. And that's what Monkman is so clearly depicting here, the way in which the figure of the native other is a kind of erotic figure for the white settler who, you know, both wants to obliterate and be obliterated by this indigenous other that they have conjured. So, but bewilderment, I'll get into blackness in a minute. My slides are a little bit out of order here. Let me go into bewilderment. Bewilderment for me, obviously it's a word with a long history. It meant to lose yourself in pathless places in the 18th century. But I suggest that bewilderment is the way in which we've produced the indigenous as something that came before and that has been superseded by modernist aesthetics and modernist knowledge. And instead, in places like Kent Monkman's work, we find out that modernism is a complete afterglow of indigenous aesthetics. And I just want to give an example of that. That doesn't sound right to people. So this is an image from Stravinsky and Nijinsky's famous ballet from 1913, The Rite of Spring. And The Rite of Spring, you know, is a really fascinating ballet and has an incredible story, precisely because it was performed in 1913 exactly 2 or 3 times. And then the dancers felt that they could no longer manage this ballet. It was too difficult, and it was never performed again. But it was re-performed by the Joffrey Ballet in 1987. And I want to actually give you a little clip from The Rite of Spring to show the way in which the fantasy of indigenous cultures are brought into this ballet that became a kind of canonical centerpiece of musical and dance modernism. The way in which the fantasy of indigenous others is folded into the ballet and yet exceeds that folding in. So I'm just going to play a little clip here. And this, by the way, I should say, this is the Joffrey Ballet's version, but Nijinsky did not write down his choreography. So any version of The Rite of Spring is a fantasy. It's a recreation of what we think The Rite of Spring might have been. And there are 2 people, Millicent Dodson and Kenneth Archer, who put this ballet back together again and were able to have the Joffrey Ballet actually perform it. It is an incredible work, and it is a work in which these Russian artists draw from what they think is indigenous cultures of Russia and other places, and they bring those cultures into the heart of Europe and dance a dance of fertility until, you know, the chosen one, the main figure in the ballet, dances herself to death. So here's a little clip from it. I'll stop it there. You can actually watch this on YouTube. But, you know, the myth around Rite of Spring is that when Rite of Spring was performed in 1913, it was literally booed off the stage. The audience in Paris didn't want to watch it. They thought that they were seeing something hideous. They were seeing ballet being broken. Ballet is supposed to be these balletic leaps across the stage. It's supposed to be graceful. It's supposed to be about the line. And here you have people who are pigeon-toed. Their knees are turned in, they're knock-kneed, and they're jumping up and down. There's none of that leaping, soaring, flying activity that ballet, you know, French ballet, moreover, is supposed to conjure. Instead, this is, you know, again, the colonial fantasy of the indigenous is the breaking of ballet itself. Now, what's amazing about the ballet, if you like, is that the fantasy of the indigenous that is brought to bear upon this European form is not, what would you say, contained by its representation. It actually exceeds it and becomes something else entirely. It becomes beautiful in its own way. And the critics at the time, you know, there were rapturous receptions of this ballet, despite the fact that the bourgeois audience that attended the performance that night walked out and booed and hissed. And at least one critic has said that the booing and the hissing, far from being the riot that as it's gone down in history, was in fact kind of racial outrage. Like this, you know, sensibilities were offended by seeing this kind of movement on the Parisian stage, you know. So this is amazing in and of itself. But later on, you can see in a recreation of Rite of Spring in the work of Kent Monkman, you can see what it is that I'm calling bewilderment. Okay, so bewilderment I'm proposing is a system within which white culture imports or steals fragments of native culture and then creates a chaotic and noisy cultural space within which the copy and the original become fused. And that creates a kind of bewildering sense of, what am I watching? Am I watching colonial appropriation, or am I watching the emergence of an indigenous aesthetic? So Kent Monkman, and this is very much, I think, Monkman's aesthetic, he decided that he wanted to perform something in response to a George Catlin painting from 1891 called Dance to the Berdache. And this itself is kind of a beautiful painting. And it is, you know, referring to the two-spirit figure within a particular tribe and a dance that accompanied the tribe's acknowledgement of the Berdache figure. Catlin himself claimed that he wrote this, he made this painting to record what he thought was a hideous, savage kind of ritual. And he said it was the most disgusting native ritual he ever saw. So Monkman read this account in Catlin's diary, saw the painting, and decided that he would perform a version of the dance of the Berdache. So he wanted to bring that painting to life. So what you saw when you went into the performance space, and by the way, Kent Monkman often performs as his alter ego, Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, were all of these buffalo hides onto which the dance that Monkman performed was projected. But the important piece here, for my purposes, is the music that Monkman chose to perform the dance to was a version of Rite of Spring that had been written by a native Toronto-based musician. And so here, Rite of Spring comes right around in that bewildering form that I'm suggesting, where the indigenous refuse to be appropriated, and indigenous culture sort of literally speaks back and takes back, you know, not takes back a kind of original performance, but answers back to modernism in a way that becomes much bigger than the modernist spectacle itself. So that's, this aesthetic of bewilderment is definitely a big part of the book. So I've suggested two different areas then so far. Where the Wild Things Are, where you begin to see this aesthetic of bewilderment, the relationship between Max and the wild things, the relationship between the wild things and space, the relationship between all of them and animality, ruination, and so on. And then these high cultural texts within modernism, where indigenous work is appropriated, but through a process of bewilderment, those modernist texts stand revealed as part and parcel of, in fact, indigenous aesthetics. The second part of the book is more interested in the animal part of the equation of wildness. And I'll do this a little bit more quickly in the interest of time, just to say that I have a whole section of the book devoted to queer narratives about falconry. And you wouldn't think that falconry would be a queer topic, but if I just even mention that things like chaps and leather twist, tresses, jesses, I think they're called, the things that you wrap around your arm to hold the falcon, big leather gloves, hoods. Is this paraphernalia of a gay man in a leather bar on a Saturday night? Yes, but it's also the paraphernalia of falconry. And falconry, it turns out, is a main feature of some lost narratives of queer life from the middle of the 20th century. And I go through these narratives in my chapter 4, arguing for something that I call an epistemology of the ferox, which of course is riffing on Eve Sedgwick's very famous The Epistemology of the Closet. And Sedgwick proposed that in the 20th century, being sort of orients around knowing and not knowing, and that the figure for this knowing and not knowing is the closet. And so if you don't know what someone's sexuality is, you do know what it is, because you know that they are gay by virtue of the fact that it has been masked or cloaked. Now, we've all been very influenced by this work, but it's obvious that there are many other epistemological systems that also work through other kinds of sexuality. So the epistemology of the ferox takes the Latin word for fierce or feral, which is ferox, and argues that this binary of domestic and feral is equally important to thinking about desire in the 20th century. And I do a close reading of Helen MacDonald's H is for Hawk and T.H. White's book, The Goshawk, that she reads alongside her own narrative of training hawk. So those of you who are interested in the falconry piece, please look at that chapter. I do want to go back to this image and just say that the relationship between Blackness and wildness is possibly less obvious than the relationship between indigeneity and wildness. We're very clear that wildness is a term that has been used for the so-called Indian, that the colonial encounter has produced the category of the wild. But Blackness too, as a kind of a force of being that white supremacy must tame, is very much associated with wildness. And you only have to think back to the Central Park trial of 5 Black men for a rape that they did not commit in the 1980s in New York City. And the fact that those Black men were accused of wilding to see that that white supremacist fantasies about Black freedom run in the direction of wildness. And I try in the book, using the work of Langston Hughes, Isaac Julian, and others, to think about the fugitivity that Fred Moten and others have talked about as part of a kind of response to white supremacy that links Blackness and wildness together in a productive rather than a racializing way. Okay, finally, I will end with what is turned out to be the most controversial part of the book, which is towards the end of the book, I say, okay, well, what relationship should we have to animals? And I suggest that it is in our relationships to pets that wildness goes to die. This is the place where we lose all sense of desire for wildness, and we domesticate. Our relationship to the pet is in miniature an example of the way in which the human, particularly under the auspices of white supremacy, wants to domesticate everything in the world around it. And I propose that we have a kind of deep desire for wildness, but a tendency to squash wildness out of existence, and leaving in its place zombification. And so I bring together the wildness of the zombie and the domestication of the pet, and propose that your little kitty cat or your dog, who you imagine gives you a kind of channel to wildness, is in fact just the latest form of zombification that the human has set in motion. So I use pets to signify a whole set of processes that are part and parcel, I would argue, of environmental decline, that are as bothersome as the meat industry, and as habitat destruction that, by the way, has led to COVID-19 in the first place. And that it is in this intimate sphere, in these intimate relations, that we might want to ask much deeper questions about wildness, domestication, animality, and zombification. So just to end then, finally, my book is the first part of an argument for unbuilding worlds. Then the second book in this project will take up. And so I just want to say that if earlier moments of queer theory were preoccupied with world making, and you can think of the work of Jose Munoz here, to whom my book is dedicated, and Eve Sedgwick, in the current crisis, I argue that we may find that rather than wanting to extend the world or make new spaces within it, we long for its destruction. My book begins the work of imagining the labor that has to go into dismantling, unbuilding, destroying, unknowing, and unmaking everything around us. And I will stop sharing my screen and stop speaking.
Thank you, Jack. That was wonderful. Now we're going to have some comments from María Elena García, followed by Radhika Govindrajan and myself. And then Jack, we'll have you respond. And please, folks, keep your questions in the chat coming.
Great. Thank you so much, Chandan. I'm really pleased to join you all from where I live here on Coast Salish lands. And I just want to kind of reiterate Chandan's gratitude and thank Elliott Bay Books and the Simpson Center for sponsoring and hosting this conversation, and Caitlin Palo, especially for all the work that she's been doing behind the scenes, and Chandan for introducing me to this incredible book and inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's really hard to make time in the midst of everything else right now to find a moment to think with others in this way, and especially such treasured friends and colleagues. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity. And Jack, it is so lovely to meet you. Reading your book has been really an amazing ride. I found it incredibly generative, and I learned a tremendous amount. As Chandan already noted, I'm María Elena García. I'm an anthropologist of Quechua ancestry, and I teach in the Comparative History of Ideas department at the University of Washington. Most of my scholarly work centers on Indigenous politics and relations in the Andes, and focuses on the varied ways Native peoples have formed part of broad challenges to settler colonial projects in the lands now known as Peru. My work is also an extension of my family and kinship relations in Peru. Thinking with other scholars in Native studies, the centrality of relations and the reciprocal obligations that come with them has become central to my engagement with rethinking what our work as scholars should be. There's a tremendous amount that I could say about this incredibly rich book, and I could go on for a long time. So what I'm going to do is really focus my discussion by asking some questions that in different ways, I think all speak to relations. I'll start though by saying that Wild Things made me feel deeply It made me smile and laugh, it moved me, and it made me uneasy and at times deeply uncomfortable. From the very beginning, Jack, your mention of hedgehogs made me immediately think of Radhika, who loves those little critters. And as she was in India at the time, and I really missed her greatly, this was a wonderful, wonderful thing. And in your readings of Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, I could not help but think of my son Tonio's elaborate forts, of his insistence in not just constructing them in the middle of our living room, but protecting them from destruction by his parents. I could think of those forts as both acts of building and scenes of unmaking, as you write. I will now forever think of Tonio's forts as him in his own way, opening up questions and alternate realities about relations, hierarchies, responsibilities. I was moved too, deeply moved in particular, by the idea of being unexplained, of, quote, existing without explanation, without a niche, outside of an orderly and inevitable scheme of life, unquote. For several reasons, this discussion reminded me of the work of Taiwanese American artist Sandy Yi, who makes clothing for differently sized and abled persons, from gloves for hands with 0 to 6 fingers to baby onesies with a range of sleeves. As queer and disability studies scholar Alison Kafer notes in a beautiful essay about what she calls crip kin making, Yi was moved to create these onesies after conversations with families who had children with limb differences and who were unable to find appropriate clothing, symbolized for her a larger feeling of isolation and unbelonging. Kafer's essay resonated with your work so much for me, I think, because of its sensorial and sensuous dimension, because of how often touch, taste, movement, or sound emerge as crucial for thinking about, as you put it, new ways of listening, different forms of knowing, and alternative logics of embodiment. Your work in this sense also brought to mind the vibrating and humming gardens that anthropologist Christina Lyons describes in her ethnography of soil and decomposition. Lyons amplifies the work and words of radical indigenous farmers in Colombia, in the Putumayo, in fact, who are attuned to and enmeshed with the sensorial density and textured materialities of plants, who care for and cultivate these gardens as one strategy for survivance in the midst of ongoing violence, who insist on the importance of listening to what Lyons calls the cacophony of vital frequencies produced by those gardens as one way of enacting alternative presents, pasts, and futures. But I want to get to my questions. So to my mind, your work offers a crucial intervention, particularly at this moment of both reinvigorated fascism and authoritarianism and the celebration of liberal humanism. You offer us, as you say, quote, a challenge to an assumed order of things from, by, and on behalf of things that refuse and resist order itself. You remind us of the importance of unmaking and unbuilding worlds, of imagining alternative futures while also calling into question the very idea of futurity. And you insist on the importance of not knowing, of moving beyond that colonial imperative to know, to name, to classify, and thereby tame and control. This is something that I'm trying to think about and think through in an entirely different context. In the aftermath of war, of a particularly intense period of violence in Peru, and as dominant narratives in the country foreground transitional justice and the usual moving forward and leaving the past behind, I'm trying to think with haunting, and in particular with the ghosts of more than human others brutalized by the violence of war and coloniality. How do we listen to those ghosts? What are the possibilities opened up by not knowing? Do those non-human ghosts who wander through Andean valleys and rivers demand justice? Do they ask to be remembered? What are the ghastly memories embedded in lands, in rivers? What do glaciers remember and how do they respond? So I would love to hear you say more about this idea of not knowing, why it matters, and what it opens up for you. And maybe one way to open up a conversation about this is in relation to teaching. In the classroom, my work with students is very often about refusal, about imagining otherwise, about expanding engagement through the senses. And students find our readings and discussions generative and inspiring and also challenging. They often need something to hold on to, especially as we imagine alongside learning about and fighting against racial capital, white supremacy, the disposability of life, the racial, colonial, patriarchal violence that seems to be only increasing each day. In Wild Things, you ask this powerful and provocative question. Can we live with the bewilderment that accompanies the desire to end that world without knowing what comes next? So I'm really curious about the kinds of conversations that this inspires with your students. How does it land? This is something we were talking about at the beginning before we went live. Or is the desire to translate or ground this discussion part of the problem? So I would love to hear you say more about how you navigate these difficult conversations, particularly with students who are grappling with these questions and realities in visceral ways. Something else I thought about as I read your work was about points of connection and disconnection. In Spanish, we would say encuentros y desencuentros, with some Native scholarship, particularly around more than human vibrancy and alternative or expansive desires. For example, you write, wildness is the absence of order, the entropic force of a chaos that constantly spins away from biopolitical attempts to manage life and bodies and desires. Wildness has no goal, no point of liberation that beckons off in the distance, no shape that must be assumed, no outcome that must be desired. Wildness instead disorders desire and desires disorder. And I found myself saying, yes, I love this. And I also wondered, what are the ethics, obligations, and politics at play here? Do you see your work, this project, for example, as being in conversation with Kim Tallbear's work on critical and consensual non-monogamy, on what she frames as making love and relations beyond settler sex and family? Tallbear is invested in opposing systems of compulsory settler sexuality and family, in recognizing possibilities of other kinds of intimacies not focused on biological reproduction and making population. As she writes, as part of decolonial efforts, can we work ourselves into a web of relations? In small moments of possibility, can we resist naming sex between persons and sexuality as nameable objects? Can such disaggregation help us decolonize the ways in which we engage other bodies intimately, whether those are human bodies, bodies of water or land, the bodies of other living beings, and the vitality of our ancestors and other beings no longer or not yet embodied? By focusing on actual states of relation, on being in good relation with, making kin, and with less monitoring and regulation of categories, might that spur more just interactions? Your work is clearly in conversation with Native theorists and artists, as your discussions of Jody Bird and Kent Monkman, among many others, shows. Indeed, you critique Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet, as you just mentioned, in part because, as you argue, it can be thought of as yet one more colonial mode of knowing, that it depends on the obliteration of ways of knowing that have been associated with Native cosmologies. Instead, you offer an epistemology of wildness, which, as you write, swaps out the image of an interior room representing a secret self for a wide open space across which an unknowable self is dispersed. But Native epistemologies and ontologies emerge from and are linked to specific relations with specific beings at specific moments. They are embedded in relational ethics, in an obligation and connection. You tell us that wildness offers access to other forms of knowledge. With wildness, you write, we leave the strictures of the home and enter a larger world of vegetation and animals, rocks and landscapes, water and creatures seen and unseen, unquote. And you cite Jane Bennett and Eduardo Kohn, among others, to talk about the various ways scholars have also been thinking about wildness as offering, as you write, a way of being in the world differently, of interacting with rather than separating from vegetal and animal forms of life. As you must know, many Native theorists like Zoe Todd, Sarah Hunt, Kim Tallbear, and others have offered important critiques of work in new materialisms and the ontological turn, of which Bennett and Kohn are both a part, for the invisibilization of Indigenous knowledge. So back to my question, I'm curious about where you see connection and where your project might perhaps be adjacent to or depart from similar Indigenous projects and aspirations. What are the encuentros and desencuentros here? Additionally, you rightly note that figures of Blackness and indigeneity haunt all discussions of wildness and wilderness. They certainly continue to haunt this text, often in powerful and disturbing ways. We could think about casements, violation of Black and Native bodies, or of the ways Native writers have also been theorizing zombies and apocalypse narratives. But thinking once again with the frame of relations, I want to ask you about your inclusion and discussion of Austrian artist Ines Dujak's provocative piece, Not Dressed for Conquering. For those who have not read your book, here's how you describe it. Dujak's piece, Not Dressed for Conquering, depicts a three-way sodomitical encounter involving former Spanish King Juan Carlos, Bolivian feminist and labor leader Domitila Chungara, and a dog/wolf figure. As you note, this controversial sculpture was ultimately censored, a decision that you very rightly critique, and you provide this reading of the work. And here I'm quoting from pages 129 and 130. The middle figure in this sequence also commands our attention. Breaking with the male chain of homoerotic power, Chungara appears here sodomizing the King of Spain. The fact that she is also sodomized here by a wolf could indicate her own subjugation. And yet, Dujak represents Chungara and the wolf as upright, as potential partners, while the king is on all fours and bent over. If Chungara and the wolf are connected in their project to humiliate and defeat the king, then the spectacle of bestiality serves not as a scene of subjugation for Chungara, but as a statement of solidarity between the feminist and the wild creature she does not seek to control. This is an interesting interpretation, and I understand that this work made sense to include given your discussion of Derrida's The Beast and the Sovereign, which is a direct inspiration for the sculpture. However, I was struck by the lack of context we are offered here, especially in contrast to so many other works of art you discuss in the text. And as you might imagine, I was particularly troubled by the inclusion of Domitila Barrios de Chungara in this work of art. In addition to being a feminist labor leader, Domitila, as most people call her in Bolivia, was also an Aymara indigenous woman, an Aymara woman who survived a massacre, who survived multiple experiences of imprisonment, torture, and rape, who had to live in exile for her own safety. She was also defiant, politically astute, and incredibly resilient. She spoke and fought back. She made her voice heard. I wanted to know why Domitila is included in this piece. If she is the main character, as many critics insist, what or who does she stand in for? What has this European artist said about her significance, her inclusion? As I looked for more details about this work of art, I found many discussions of censorship, the politics of curation, the King and Queen of Spain, but almost nothing about Domitila and her inclusion in this work. I found out that Ines Dujak is an Austrian artist who has been traveling to Andean countries since 1978, around the time Domitila was leading a hunger strike against the dictatorship of Hugo Banzer. And I learned that she collects Andean textiles because, quote, they speak and have stories to talk about, unquote. In 2009, she was awarded 350,000 euros from the Austrian state to produce art-based research in Bolivia. Perhaps this is where and when she learned about Domitila. But other than stating that the work, quote, plays with power relations and subverts them, I have not been able to find other comments by the artist about this piece. It won't surprise you to know that Andean critics have come up with alternative readings. Let me just share a few lines from a thoughtful 2015 essay by Imaina Cáceres, a Peruvian artist, critic, and member of the Andean collective Trenza. Cáceres writes, in the center of all gazes, in the very middle of an artwork that supposedly criticizes colonialism, Domitila and what she represents remains invisible to all. And speaking about the furor over the censorship of this piece, she continues, in the most mediatic moment a political artist concerned with oppression could wish for, Ines Dujak says nothing. Neither do the curators. Nobody speaks up or seems to be bothered by the objectification of Domitila. The whole perspective that would make her struggle as a political subject understood is missing. She goes on, the paradoxical aspects of this is that Domitila Barrios became famous precisely because she made her voice heard in the most adverse circumstances. Even when imprisoned and pregnant, she survives a physical assault and a violent rape by the police that seeks to traumatize her activism. This is a part of systemic measures in Latin America that silence and kill indigenous populations that protest against neoliberal measures. Domitila, returning kicks and spits, makes herself heard and never renounces her own agency. Knowing this history makes showing her in this situation more violent, unquote. So following this line of thought, how do we think about this kind of provocation also in the context of colonial histories of dogs being weaponized against indigenous bodies, and the history of dogs being used by military regimes like those in Bolivia to penetrate and torture female bodies in particular? How does Dujak's work align with your reading and deployment of the wild as epistemology, as, quote, a terrain of alternative formulations that resist the orderly impulses of modernity, and as a merging of anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, and radical queer interests, unquote? And also, how should we think about the appropriation of the image of an indigenous social movement leader for a work commissioned by and for Europeans? Here are the words of Domitila herself about the way Europeans and others extract from Bolivia are important. She said, "Of all those materials that they take, there are very few which return. I would like to ask all these people who think they want to collaborate with us that all the material that they took, that they return it to us so that it is useful for the study of our own reality." So to come back to my earlier question, what are the ethics of relationality, reciprocity, and solidarity in the worlds of wildness? There's a lot more that I could raise, but I think I'm going to leave it at that for now. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts. I know there's a lot there to unpack. Thank you.
Thank you, María Elena, for those comments. It's hard to follow on that, but I'm excited to be in conversation with all of you. Thank you, Chandan, for organizing this. And thank you, Jack, for this wonderful book. I've been wanting to read this book for a very long time. As I said to you earlier, so much of your thought and wildness has really shaped my own work. And this was a pleasure to read. And like María Elena, I found myself scribbling all the time and troubled at particular moments and just laughing and enjoying it. So thank you very much. I'm also now, as I was saying to you earlier, going to frame my disordered thoughts as an expression of my brain going wild and think of that as a radical politics. So forgive me if what I'm going to say is completely disordered, but I want to think with you about the relationship between wildness, order, disorder, fascism, and humanism. But before that, I wanted to share with the audience some of what the politics of wildness permits. You called it an epistemology of wildness, but I think it's also a politics of wildness and a politics that promises a way out of this moment, a new way of doing politics. And you remind us that there is an importance to working with wildness despite the risks. The risks, as you tell us, is that the wild has served to name the orders of being that colonial authority comes to tame. The others to a disastrous discourse of civilization, the reifying operations of racial discourse, the doings of race. And yet it also offers a way of unmaking and unbuilding worlds. And you remind us that colonial notions of the wild do not exhaust its meaning, that it can be a site of human unknowing, a space of pleasurable bewilderment. I love the idea of bewilderment, and I would love to talk more about that in the discussion. But it's also a relationship to disorder. The wild questions the hierarchies of being that have been designed to mark and patrol the boundaries between the human and everything else. With wildness, and this is something that María Elena quoted as well, we leave the strictures, indeed the internal confines of the home, and enter a larger world of vegetation and animals, rocks and landscapes, water and creatures, seen and unseen. I think the wildness makes the sense unknowable. It makes a knowing possible from a place of unknowing, right? So for you, this is the promise of wildness, the reason that it's worth staying with despite all of its troubles. And what I think the book does so powerfully is take us to that territory, that really troubled territory, without once moving away from the trouble and giving into the seductions of the radical possibilities of wildness. And I thank you for that, because there were many moments in which I was completely taken with the political possibilities that wildness offered. And then you would drag us back to the trouble of wildness in ways that I thought were really important and productive and really difficult to do. But what I wanted to think about, I read this when I was in the mountains in India, and I read it a few days after there was this event where a glacier burst, and there were 150 people were missing, and there were these really kind of apocalyptic videos that were all over the internet of water just razing people's homes, entering people's homes, taking people with them. And I was struck also by your own sense of this kind of impending apocalypse, right? That this book was written in many ways under the shadow of what you call post-natural climate collapse. And as I was reading it, I was wondering, at whom is the invitation to disorder directed? Because one thing that people there were saying constantly was that, you know, this is our lives, right? This disorder is the condition of our lives. This is something that we live every year. That wildness is not something that is outside the confines of the home. The problem is that the wild is too far inside the home, that it's perfectly comfortable within these domestic spaces, be it, you know, the mud that sort of makes people's houses collapse every monsoon, the animals that enter people's homes in this space, which is seeing growing human-wildlife conflict, which many people attribute to the conditions that we're in with climate change. And so what people wanted was order. What they wanted was balance, right? This was something that people said, we need more law and order. We need a balance that is restored to our lives. We need the wild to be pushed out. And I was thinking also with the work of the anthropologist Elizabeth Roberts, who works in Mexico City, and notes that so much of the emphasis on entanglement, particularly in anthropology, ignores the fact that entanglement is the condition of life in the context of racial capitalism. Life is always and already entangled with chronic economic and political instability, and what people want is stability through the remaking of boundaries. And I was wondering what we do with that. You know, what do we do with the fact that people want authority, they want governance, they want development in many contexts that where development and governance have left their most violent impacts. So colonial authority, in fact, works by sowing disorder through creating these conditions of unknowing, and knowing and order then become ways of establishing the dignity of life. And I was wondering then if we can think of efforts to impose order as opposed to disorder as a politics of the wild. So would wildness actually mean a restoration of order as opposed to an embrace of disorder? And what might it mean to think of wildness as all of these things together and not abandon the desire for order? I was also thinking about how the wild is opposed to a certain kind of liberal bourgeois humanism that uses the categories of the wild. And you're using Sylvia Wynter here to suggest that ultimately the categories of the wild produced an imperial order of man that were dependent on a series of foundational hierarchies, all organized around an exaggerated sense of the power of colonial masculinity. But I found myself thinking about other ways of being human. And I was thinking of Zakiya Iman Jackson's fabulous new book, which suggests that, you know, that there are alternate possibilities of being human that don't always rely on animal abjection. And coming back to India, which is a context I know well, I was thinking of other kinds of radical humanisms that have been offered up as a way of establishing just a politics that refuses the violence of caste capital in this case. And I'm thinking of the writings of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the anti-caste activist, the lawyer, the author of the Indian Constitution. And Ambedkar, writing about caste, argues that caste ultimately denies humanity, or the Brahmanism denies humanity to those that it doesn't see as equals. Right. And Ambedkar, when asked to think about what a true democracy would look like, suggests that there is a need to return to the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, those ideals that we think of as being at the core of this liberal, violent humanism. And Ambedkar writes in this one moment when he's waiting at a station. And I was struck by this part because of the word he uses, but he's waiting at a station and the station master asks who they are. And Ambedkar names their castes. And he writes, we could see that he was overpowered by a strange feeling of repulsion. And he left, and we were quite bewildered. And I thought the use of the word bewildered was really interesting in that context to signify something entirely different in relation to wildness and the ways in which caste uses that. And he suggested that the only way out of this form of bewilderment, out of this violence, out of this disrecognition, was a radical fraternity between humans, where one essentially experienced, and I'm quoting him, an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men. So kinship and fraternity between humans would become the basis of a liberatory humanism. But there was a desire to also maintain the human as a sacrosanct category. And I think that that is something that is so critical in this particular moment, this politics of recognition that is not liberal recognition, but a different kind of recognition in the context of growing fascism in India, where what's interesting about fascist politics in India is that it is a politics that erases the boundaries between human and non-human with tremendous ease. And I work myself on the politics of cow protection. And a number of upper caste Hindus who identify with the Hindu right are much more comfortable letting the cow in than they are letting other members of society who they identify as subhuman, be they Dalit, Muslim, Adivasi, Christian, in. And so in that moment, refusing that blurring of the boundary, refusing to let the wild in because they've always been out in the wild, becomes a politics of wildness, in the sense that you want to invoke a possibility of being otherwise. So I was wondering if we might think with that too. And finally, this is a wrap up now because I know there's so many other people with questions and Chandan waiting too. I was hoping we could talk about religion in the book. This in so many ways, this is a book that sees wildness as emerging in a post-religious world. But I was thinking with what Emmy said about indigenous cosmologies, I was thinking also about the region in which I do fieldwork, where God is part and deities are part of the wild, right? They also navigate the wild. And I'm wondering where religion is in relation to wildness, order, disorder, and the human. But thank you again. This is such a tremendous book, and it's such a joy to be in conversation with you.
So, thank you, Radhika. It's a joy to go up after both you, María Elena, and Radhika. Jack, I am just going to pose a very simple question because I think we have so much on the table already. One thing I want to share for people who are listening in is that this is a book that is asking us to think about the ways that what we understand as politics shapes so much of how we think and what we desire, and how it is that we can start to think beyond the world that politics gives us. So in a lot of ways, we turn to the past when we are, for example, Jack has this amazing reading of different queer kinds of archives, people that one would want to turn to see it, one, were there queers in the past, and two, are they people that I can identify with, and were they struggling for their liberation? And what he discovers is that when you turn to these figures, they're actually much more complex. And we start to lose a way of dealing with their complexity because our political lexicon either has that they're oppressors or they're the oppressed, that they're either people who subordinate or they are people who fight for liberation and freedom. And sometimes we are aware that there are other kinds of folks out there that have left some kind of record, and how they come into the record is as interesting to Jack as what they left behind. And that's what makes this text so interesting. And that they come into the record not as histories of freedom, but as histories of the wild. And it's against thinking of the past as a place only to find questions of liberation, and instead to look at our relationship to what he calls wild things, which are what people are turned into in the process of becoming archived. And I just want to invite Jack to maybe offer us how you got here, how a scholar of sexuality studies got to this question of the wild, and why it's so crucial in this moment of kind of affirmatory trans politics, affirmatory gay politics, gay marriage, gays and their pets. If you could just, share the context of this.
Wow. Okay. There's just so many amazing questions here. Look, one thing I think that needs to be said, and that follows on what Chandan just proposed, is that, I'm not just like, in the same way that the queer art of failure wasn't just saying, hey, everyone, failure is the way to go now. We should all fail better, and then we will then pick apart the logics of success. Similarly, I'm not saying, hey, if we could only go wild, then somehow we would find our way out of environmental ruin and liberal politics. And I know no one's saying that, but it is important what Chandan proposed, which is that this is a kind of, it's almost like a history of the idea of wildness, but that would be way too organized of a project for me to do. You know, I probably could not pull that off. It is a history of wildness and a history of the way in which people have contested the category of wildness and proposed wildness as a portal to some other way of thinking. Now, this book won't take you even to that other way of thinking, but what it tries to do, and it is a modest project really, is to just unpick a few knots that tether liberal personhood to order, governance, rule, knowing, whiteness, right, in ways that have become unassailable at this point. And I do tend to like these, you know, to answer that question that Chandan asked me most recently, like, well, what brought you to wildness? I do tend to get drawn to these counterintuitive thematics, if you like, that seem as if they are blasted through and through with a kind of negative capacity that can only do us harm, and yet hold within it some inkling of other ways of thinking and other ways of being. Now, that said, you know, I do want to say something to María Elena's comments, which was so powerful. You know, this book is not by any means a book anywhere near the category of Indigenous studies. You know, I don't do Indigenous studies, but I wanted to write about Kent Monkman's work, is really the truth of it. And I wanted to take on the way in which wildness was being used as part of a kind of, as Jody Bird puts it, this evolutionary narrative that places Indigenous people in the past and then rushes on to a future without them. And I found that in Monkman's work, there was a little glimmer of an answer to that kind of settler colonial project, in the sense of the way in which Monkman was able to orient towards all of modernist art and then undo it from within. You know, he has paintings of riots within which there are Picasso bulls and there are Manet toreadors, but there are also totem poles and native healers. You know, so he horizontalizes the world, and he doesn't push Euro-American culture aside. He shows the way in which Euro-American culture is a little tiny dot within much larger cosmologies about which European culture knows nothing and does not want to know anything. And that reversal, to answer one of the questions in the chat, is what I mean by bewilderment. It's where the will to know is taken back and wrapped within a different cosmology that undoes it. And in the undoing, some other kind of aesthetic emerges. The point that María Elena makes about the representation of Gamatia Chungara is really important. And I mean, pragmatically, that essay was written for a catalog about that piece. After Paul Preciado and his co-curator were fired. There's a way in which I also don't really care about Inez Dujac's work. I found what was most interesting to me in the piece was that a Spanish museum could not tolerate an image of the sovereign being sodomized. And in fact, there is apparently a Spanish law against representations of the king being sodomized, if you can believe it. But it is part of what we must understand as sovereign power, that you control the terms of representation through which you enter into meaning. And I think, you know, it was interesting that Tiongara was in the piece, and I, as you say, I tried to make something of it, but completely under-theorized in that piece. And it does exactly raise the question of how wildness gets associated with animality on the one hand, indigeneity on the other, and then just used in a Euro-American context to kind of bludgeon you know, an authority figure, right? As opposed to it having any kind of legibility or credibility or generative power on its own. And I think you laid out that beautifully, exactly how that happens. So, you know, in that respect, what the book was difficult. I have to say, you know, Chandan, I probably thought that I was writing on a topic that I could get away with thinking romantically about. And the more I dug into the category of the wild, the harder the book became. You know, it was harder and harder to access what is a utopian set of possibilities that are embedded in the wild without, you know, as Radhika's work shows, realizing that wildness is also part of a colonial production in order to manage certain animal groups and manage people's relationships to those animal groups. And so these animals are going to be classified as wild and therefore untouchable within a particular region, and another set of animals are registered as domestic. Wildness, it does not have an autonomous existence prior to the colonial production of the wild. It just doesn't. And that means that it is torture to try to pull what you feel is so generative in the category, to pull it apart from these webs of power, violence, and management that, you know, enfold it. So that's the struggle in the book. And that's, I mean, what I really love about these responses is that they are tuned in to the ambiguity in the book and the book's own failure to manage to loose wildness from all of these historically complex contexts.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think that's quite amazing, Jack. I mean, I want you to talk a little bit more about how wildness sits with your larger project, because, you know, I'm reminded of your work on masculinity. I mean, your work on masculinity, on the one hand, was trying to make an argument that there are enactments in masculinity that are happening that we refuse to talk about because we don't either think that they're real masculinity or we don't have a lexicon for them because all we have is the lexicon of either androcentrism or feminist radicalism. And at the same time that you are trying to produce a kind of alternative masculinity, you are trying to understand what it is, how masculinity is so otherwise remarkably corrosive, you know, male masculinity. And so you've always been working with these polluted categories because that is only where some of us are going to find modes of existence. And so in a way, there is a queer trajectory that I also want to really have you speak to.
Yeah, that's right, Chandan. There is a way in which I want to pull down some of these heroic narratives, you know, in the Roger Casement chapter, which I didn't talk about. You know, Roger Casement was an Irish national who is credited as kind of the father of human rights. And he spent time in the early 20th century. He was sent by the British government to the Putumayo region, but also in Colombia. And also to the Congo, to see how colonial settlers were treating native peoples. And of course, it was atrocious. And he reported back, and his reports are credited as a kind of foundation for human rights. And of course, we could go into our critique of human rights, but that's how he sort of enters into history. Then Casement is so, this is what queer history should be, Chandan. That's exactly the point. So then you're like, oh, wow, the gay guy who's the good guy, who's the father of human rights. But then Casement decided that his insights into colonialism that he gleaned from his work made him realize that Ireland was the Congo of Europe. And so he went in 1913, he went to Germany as Europe was on the brink of war. And he said to Germany, I know you're ready to go to war with Britain. What if I could get Ireland to join you? Because we also want to go to war with Britain. The Germans turned him over to the English, and he was put on trial for treason, at which point Irish nationalism and the Irish nationalists kicked in and tried to support him, and these Black Diaries were released. And in the Black Diaries, we found out that Roger Casement was having lots of sex with Black and brown boys on his travels. Even that would be okay, but he also had these diaries in which he kept records of these transactions, in which he recorded the physical type of the boy with whom he had sex. And they were mostly very, very young men, boys in his parlance. He noted the length of the penis and how much money he paid them. And these Black Diaries at the end of the day did him in, and he was hung for treason. The thing about Roger Casement is, history is full of such people, right? But we tell the histories of kind of the cherry-picked histories of the gay, lesbian, and trans people that we want to fashion an identity politics around. So Chandan, I think what you're trying to get me to sort of admit to is that the book is a kind of, it's a reply to an identitarian project. Yeah, that wants to hold out that we might have to have queer histories that are unpleasant, and in which we talk about queer colonials, and we talk about racism and white supremacy as it runs directly through queerness, transness, and whatever else. And that kind of complicity is way more interesting, seeing the way in which, as Engbeng Lim's work shows, the white colonial gay man goes into the wild to find the brown boy. That's exactly the colonial mission. And therefore queerness has to be rethought, not as a heroic struggle with the closet, but as an anti-heroic, in some cases, an anti-heroic complicity with civilizational orders. And that's not all queerness is, but queerness is that too.
That's right. And I think, the argument of the book is that complicity is a kind of project that you need to learn how to work with complicity. We live in a moment where you either eject it, or you call it out, or you tweet it, but actually staying with complicity might lead us somewhere that we did not otherwise know. That's what you call bewilderment. And in that space, we might construct another kind of politics, which I think is what Radhika was talking about. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to also respond to her if you wanted before we.
Yeah. Well, I've just learned so much from Radhika about the complexity. Her book is just so exemplary on the complexity of categories that seem as if they are tidily laid out across the terrain. That an animal that is wild versus an animal that is domestic, a colonial order that is trying to domesticate versus a colonial order that is trying to script wildness, and so there is no clear path, through this, but that's the point. Clear path politics is not what we want right now. The pragmatic politics is what lets people, libertarians, just say, oh, well, let's go to the Capitol with our guns and we will take power, as if power was just this thing waiting for them, and as if it was specifically scripted for them all along. I mean, what we're looking for to push back on fascism is not clear. It's not clear. It's not a political order in which you vote to make things better. It's a political order in which everything will have to be rethought. It will. And that's the work that I think we're all trying to do. Radhika also asked me about religion, and somebody in the chats asked about following up on that. And I mean, Obviously, it's a kind of a post-religious book because the wild becomes a different kind of thing once, you know, in the Euro-American context, we move from being a culture, you know, cultures mostly organized around some concept of the great chain of being to being, you know, this kind of humanist understanding of life and death. And that's, I think, again, what Foucault is trying to lay out in the order of things. So it is a post-religious book because the category of wild enters into modernity as a post-religious category. It's an extension of an understanding of nature, but it also is capacious enough to hold many other kinds of forces, not many of which are scripted as religious. That said, and this kind of connects also back to María Elena's comments, in many cosmologies, wildness has a kind of religious sensibility, and not a religion that is oriented towards a god, but a religion in which there is a kind of respect for a world in which the human is not the centerpiece. And I think that is a religion in some ways, the sense that everything that exists does not exist only for the human. And of course, as María Elena points out, and Radhika, there are many religions, many pantheistic religions, many other kinds of cosmologies in which the human is not central. The human takes its place within multiple orders of production and reproduction and generation and so on. And I really liked, María Elena, what you were saying about Kim Tolber's work about these other webs of relations and connection and disconnection that lie outside of the nuclear family, scripted as it is by, you know, monogamy. That's, you know, that's exactly right. And that's those possibilities are exactly what psychoanalysis, you know, had set up an entire system to ward against. You know, psychoanalysis is both the analysis of and the instantiation of the nuclear family as the only way of being. And of course, the central text is civilization and its discontents. Well, what are the discontents? That's my question. We get what the civilizing order is that demands monogamy and demands nuclear families and demands national cultures. What are the discontents? That's where the wild is. That's the piece that we could call wildness, or we could call disorder, or we could call discontent. But those are the pieces that I think right now we are well advised to tune into, precisely because the threat is on all sides. It's environmental, it's political, it's global, viral, personal, interpersonal, micro, macro. We need different, and I think Chandan was implying this, we need different political vocabularies. And my only hope is that wildness could have some part in the new political vocabulary that I believe many, many people are trying to craft.
Well, Jack, I'm stunned to say that we're already out of time, and we have wonderful questions from the audience, which I'm going to forward to you and try to get you their emails to try to get responses back as well. I want to make one last plug for why everyone needs to read this book, needs to study with this book, needs to hold this book and read lines out to others with this book and buy this book, which is that Jack reminds us that at the end of the day, wildness is also about loss. Whenever you are looking, quote unquote, for the wild, you're oftentimes looking in the condition of loss, or looking for something that has just passed in your mind. The loss is the condition in which wildness appears. And we are in a time of unprecedented loss. And what I love about this book is it teaches you how to be with loss, how to be with all those who have passed on. And I lost someone today, without having to disavow it, to be abnormal enough to be with the dead, and to be with loss requires some tools. And while Jack's book gives us the tool of being with those who've passed, of being with the dead. And I encourage everyone to take this book because we are going to be offered nationalism in lieu of living with the dead. And Jack has given us a book on how we can learn how to be with the dead against nationalism. So I just want to appreciate Jack's contributions and thank him so much for this day.
Thank you all. Thank you very, very much. So are we staying in here, Chandan, or going to a different?
I think we're, end the recording. We're going to a different room. So we'll, if it's in your email.
Okay, I'll go there.
In our email?
Yeah, because I think we're still live on YouTube. So
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.